Hi everyone, I'm Amethyst, and welcome to this week's episode of Ask an Autistic.
I want a renaissance to shine a light, be the change we want, set things right. We've been waiting in the dark for so long.
The idea of neurodiversity, the neurodiversity movement, and the ideas of autism and disability acceptance are topics that have been coming up a lot, and I've been getting a lot of questions about them. So I thought I'd do a video today to talk about neurodiversity and about acceptance, and to hopefully clear up a few misconceptions about neurodiversity and answer some of your guys' questions about it. So let's get started. Neurodiversity is a movement that arose out of the social model of disability in response to the medical model of disability and cure culture. The neurodiversity movement, while being a movement and a concept all on its own, is also a part of the larger disability rights movement, which is a social justice and civil rights movement by disabled people for disabled people. Because the neurodiversity movement has arisen out of the life experiences and the struggles and the accomplishments of autistic people and other neurodivergent people, it is something that's kind of hard to define. Basically, there isn't a neurodiversity manifesto. There aren't rules that you have to follow to be a part of the neurodiversity movement, but there are some generally accepted principles, these ideas behind neurodiversity. To put it simply, neurodiversity states that everybody on the planet has a different brain, and that's okay. You may have heard the terms neurotypical and neuroatypical, or neurotypical and neurodivergent. These terms are used by members of the neurodiversity community to differentiate the majority, that is, neurotypicals, from the minority, which is neuroatypical brains. There are some people who don't really like the terms neurotypical and neuroatypical, stating that since every single person on the planet has a different brain, that there is no neurotypical, and that a better term for neuroatypical might be neurominority. But the most widely used terms are neurotypical and neuroatypical. Neurotypical referring to the larger majority, people whose brains might fall under the umbrella of normal. That is, that they don't fit the criteria for any neurological conditions or developmental disabilities or mental illnesses. People who are neuroatypical or neurodivergent or in the neurominority, however you want to say it, they do have different brains than the majority, meaning that their brains fit the criteria for a neurological condition, a developmental disability, or mental illness, or any combination of the three. The neurodiversity movement asserts that variation in the human brain is a part of the human experience, and that it's an expected part of being human, that there has always been variation in neurotype, and that there will always be variation in neurotype, and that differences in neurotype aren't necessarily inherently bad or harmful, and that the variations and differences that do exist within neurotype are not something that should be discouraged or eradicated. So what are some of the myths, the misconceptions out there about neurodiversity? Firstly, because neurodiversity is very closely entwined with autism and disability acceptance, some people believe that neurodiversity means that you don't do anything to help the disabled person in question. That's not the case. Some people seem to think that the neurodiversity movement is anti-treatment or anti-therapy, and again, not the case. The neurodiversity movement asserts that the differences in neurotype, things that aren't harmful but are just a different way of being, don't need to be corrected. So what that means is that an autistic person's natural autistic behaviors, the way that they naturally express themselves and communicate, shouldn't be corrected to be more neurotypical looking or more neurotypical sounding, and that this is actually harmful to autistic people. So in that way, yes, neurodiversity is against trying to make autistic people seem more neurotypical, making that looking normal, that trying to seem less disabled the priority. That's wrong. But what neurodiversity isn't against is things like occupational therapy for sensory processing disorder, or speech therapy for speech impairment or speech dyspraxia. The neurodiversity movement isn't against treatments either. In fact, we support the use of safe and effective treatments, medicine, biomedical treatments that have been proven and that do not carry a risk of harm greater than the benefit. Some of these safe and effective treatments might be the use of medication to treat ADHD or anxiety disorders or depression. And of course, in autistic people who have comorbid conditions, that is, conditions existing alongside of their autism, like insomnia, depression, social anxiety, epilepsy, OCD, ADHD, neurodiversity movement doesn't say you shouldn't treat those things. In fact, you should. But what doesn't benefit from treatments or from biomedical intervention is autism itself. There is no cure for autism, and so what neurodiversity does not support is any attempts to use therapy to force autistic people and children to try to look as neurotypical as possible, and the ineffective, expensive, and or dangerous treatments like MMS that people claim to be able to cure or lessen the symptoms of autism. Neurodiversity does not support anything that isn't safe or that isn't scientifically proven. Kind of in the same vein, another myth about neurodiversity is that the neurodiversity movement is against professional diagnosis, or that we believe self-diagnosis is better. While it's true that there are some autistic people out there who will never receive an official diagnosis, whether you pursue a diagnosis for yourself or for your child is your choice. And the neurodiversity movement accepts that not everyone will have the money or the resources or the time or even the accessibility to services to get a diagnosis. There are a lot of reasons that an autism diagnosis might really come in handy, particularly for children who need an IEP or a 504 plan, or for anybody who's seeking accommodation in the workforce. But again, receiving a professional diagnosis is just not a viable option for lots of autistic people on our planet. I think pretty much everyone can agree that having a diagnosis can be very helpful. It's just not necessarily necessary to know yourself that you are autistic and to be a part of the autistic community and to be a part of the neurodiversity movement. Next myth about neurodiversity is that it's only for autistic people. While the neurodiversity movement did start in large part due to the organization of the autistic community, it's pretty widely accepted now that anybody who is neuroatypical or in the neurominority kind of falls under the umbrella of neurodiversity and is welcome to be a part of the community. So that's people who have developmental or learning disabilities like Down syndrome, ADHD, epilepsy, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and then mental illnesses as well. Conditions like depression and social anxiety and OCD and bipolar disorder. Kind of attached to that myth that neurodiversity is just for autistic people is the myth that neurodiversity is only for the high-functioning autistic people. I can kind of see how this myth came about, especially since there's such a pervasive misunderstanding of what the differences between high-functioning and low-functioning autism and what the autistic experience is like, and wrong ideas about non-speaking autistic people. But there are lots of non-speaking autistic people, or autistic people who would be considered classically autistic or low-functioning, that support neurodiversity and that do advocate for autism acceptance. And I'll link to the blogs and writings of a few of these non-speaking autistic advocates in the video description below if you'd like to check that out. The last myth that I will cover today is that the neurodiversity movement says that autism isn't a disability. And I've touched on this lightly in a recent video, but in short, autism is a disability. Autistic people are disabled. We are impaired. That means that autistic people need accommodation to be able to have equal access in society and to things like education and the workforce. That means that we need to have our differences and our impairments thought of and accommodated for so that we have equal access to level the playing field, so to speak. But neurodiversity asserts that autism, as well as being a disability, is also a difference, and that there are parts of the autistic experience, of the autistic neurotype, that aren't inherently bad or harmful, that aren't inferior, they're just different. I hope this video has answered some questions for you guys and cleared up some of the myths and misconceptions about neurodiversity out there. And of course, because the neurodiversity movement doesn't have a leader, there's no manifesto, and we're not this monolith, I am not speaking for every person who advocates for neurodiversity. This is just, I think, general principles that the neurodiversity movement tends to follow and fall in line with. And to conclude, I'd just like to say that you guys have probably noticed, but the books are back. Pretty exciting. I know that many of you guys missed them. Since we got into summer, the trees in our yard, everything got really fluffy and green, lots of leaves, which is lovely and nice, but it really blocked the light in here. So I had to move up closer to the window, and I was using that white backdrop, and I didn't like it as much. I like to be by books. But thanks to the very generous contribution to my GoFundMe campaign by an anonymous donator, I was able to purchase 2 umbrella lights, which you can't see, but I'm looking at them right now. So I'll be fiddling with my camera in the next couple weeks and figuring out exactly how to use these babies, and I think it'll be great. And I'm very, very grateful to everybody who has contributed to my GoFundMe campaign so far. If you would like to check that out, again, link in the video description, as well as a link to my blog. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ask an Autistic.
I want a renaissance to shine a light, be the change we want, set things right. We've been waiting in